Welcome to our final Woodland Hills Interaction Series event of this school year with author Sara Shepard.
So thank you guys. Thanks for having me. This is awesome. Happy Friday. So I am just going to have like some pictures and things like that about how I got started writing, a little bit about my books, and then I will answer your questions. But we are going to start with a quiz about me that you'll learn. You'll learn the answers through my presentation, but if anybody wants to take a guess at the beginning, the first question is, there's only 3 questions, it's not a very hard quiz. The first book Sara ever had published was about, this is a little bit of a trick question. A, backstabbing friends, B, yellow garden creatures, or C, her mom. Anybody want to guess? C, B, A. All right, we'll find out. When Sara went to college, the thing she thought she was going to study was A, journalism, B, biology, C, music.
B.
I hear a lot of B's, I hear a lot of C's. Yeah, okay. And number 3, which character in Pretty Little Liars did Sara name after a friend from elementary school? Aria Montgomery, Toby Cavanaugh, or Ezra Fitz? Look, a lot of people are saying Ezra Fitz.
Who's your best friend?
Okay, all the answers will be revealed. All right, so I'm just going to launch right into it. When I was a kid, I was always writing. And these are a lot of my journals. Actually, these are not very many of my journals. I wrote way more. I don't know what it was. I just always wanted to be writing stories. I was always telling stories, mostly to entertain my little sister. The first story I ever wrote, not the one that was published, but the first story I ever wrote was about her security blanket named BB. BB had like a flower head and a triangle body, and it was just like her blanket's adventures. And so from then on, I was just writing. I was just writing a lot of, just writing a lot of ideas, and it was something I always felt compelled to do. Now, I often wrote. Hold on. I often wrote like a chapter 1. I would have a great idea for a story, and I'd be like, chapter 1, all right, and I would have these characters, and I would have something happen, and then I would have no idea what would happen for chapter 2, so I would totally start over with another chapter 1. So most of these journals were filled with just chapter 1s. I never completed a single anything in any of these journals. And eventually I got to the point where, this was probably about 4th grade, I said, I have decided that writing a book is too hard. So I did the secret section, which was mostly ranting about my friends or about my parents or whatever. So I tried to do a little cartoon. Again, I was in about 4th grade. And it says like, published author at the top, good author, kind of an author, me, not good author at all. And you can't really see, but I signed it like I was an artist. I didn't really think I was going to grow up and be an author, though. I just really liked writing books. However, I did publish a book when I was in elementary school. Now, it was for a school library contest. Don't get too excited. But I live in State College, PA, which is where Penn State is, and we had to write a story, and the winner got their book published, and I think it's still in the public library there. It was called Quizzles, and it was about little yellow garden creatures. I read it now. It seems like it's some sort of like hallucination. I don't know how I got the idea. It was a little crazy. But so that was sort of my first story, and I had really great teachers that encouraged me to write and to keep writing, and to those crazy ideas that you have about the garden creatures, just keep writing them. So that was the first story that I ever wrote to completion, meaning I wrote more than a chapter 1. I just like to include a picture of me when I was in high school to show you that I was a disaster. I grew up during like the grunge era of the 90s, but my sister's in the front, and I'm in the back. would you believe that we were on vacation? You wouldn't guess. We were miserable. We were at the beach. We were at the Jersey Shore. And we were so mad at our parents. I have no idea why. My sister was often my sort of creative co-conspirator. We would come up with a lot of ideas together. We would drive our parents crazy, like thinking about stories in the back of the car. And they wouldn't really want to talk to us anymore. Once I had a driver's license, I would often they would make me drive separately so we could talk. But we were always making up stories together. But all right, so I went to NYU in New York. And when I set out to go to college, I thought I was going to be a biology major. I really thought, I was into a lot of things. I was into art, I was into writing, but I was also really into science. And I think my parents were really excited about me being a biology major because they were like, oh, you can be a doctor. And so I started out as a biology major, and it was great, but then in a class, a teacher was like, now, some of you your whole career might be like being in a lab, isolating a single protein, and that might be your whole career. And I was like, that sounds awful. So at the same time, I had a great English teacher. We had to sort of take English as like core curriculum for freshman year of college. And I had a great English teacher, and she was like, you're a good writer. You should maybe be an English major. And I was like, all right. So I announced to my parents, I'm going to switch over. I'm going to be an English major. And they were like, what are you going to do with that? And I'm like, well, I'm going to read books, and I'm going to write, and I'm going to, write great essays. And they were not thrilled. But they went with it. And I got some great internships in college. I was in New York City, which was great for getting certain internships, in journalism, actually, which journalism would have been a good guess, because I did sort of consider switching to a journalism major because it was a little more useful than English. I worked for some magazines, and I knew a lot of people in publishing. And when I had graduated from college, and I was in New York City. I was poor. My sister, who was a little younger than me, also moved to New York City, and she was working for a book packager called Alloy Entertainment. And Alloy Entertainment developed stories like Gossip Girl, a series called The Click. I don't know if you guys know of that. They sort of developed big book series for young adults. And my sister said, this company that I work for, they need ghostwriters sometimes to write some of their stories. You should try out for that if you're looking for extra money. You like writing fiction. I was a terrible journalist, by the way. I tried to write articles for real papers and things like that, and I made facts up, which is never a good idea. So anyway, I tried out to be a ghostwriter. Basically, I crashed their Christmas party, this company's Christmas party. I was like, please give me a chance, please give me a chance. I was so annoying, and I bothered them every day. Please give me a chance to be a ghostwriter. And by the way, a ghostwriter is a person where you don't use your name, you don't use your idea, you just sort of execute the writing of the book. Somebody gives you a whole idea, they give you the characters, they even give you the breakdown of the story, but it's you that has to go forward and actually write the chapters and write the book and figure out how it's going to be a book. So after enough pestering, they gave me a shot. And the first book they assigned me to was called Samurai Girl. And they said, we have this great idea for you. It's about this Japanese girl. She lives in LA. She's a martial arts fighter. We think you're perfect for it. And I was like, I am none of those things. Because you always, hear write what you know and whatever. I was like, okay. But it was actually a great experience because I had to do a lot of research and get myself into the head of this character, this main character, this girl who was on the run from her gangster family and crime fighting and whatever. And it was a great crash course in writing. I learned all about how to get past chapter 1 and plot a book and write good dialogue and write great cliffhangers for the ends of chapters. I learned how to be edited. I learned how to write on deadline. And I got a little bit of money for it. Not very much, but got some money for it. From there, I was actually a ghostwriter on a couple of other things. Never My Name, you see that it's by Carrie Asai. That one is by Natalie Fast. It was all secretly me. Blackwell's Island, which I did not include a cover because I couldn't find a picture of one, was about ghosts at the turn of the century, the 20th century, in New York City. The Secret Apartment was sort of a Alfred Hitchcock, like rear window sort of kids watching weird stuff happening in other apartment buildings. And then I wrote The It Girl, which was a spin-off to the Gossip Girl series. And once I started writing that, I realized I really like writing YA. These other books were for younger kids, more like middle grade, like 4th, 5th graders. But I was like, I really like writing about teenagers because I kept all those journals. I had all those big emotions. I remember what it was like, sort of going through all this stuff with friends and relationships and parents and figuring out who you are. And I was like, I want to write more about this. So I had enough, I knew enough people in the writing world at this point where I thought I could try to develop my own idea. So the thing that I started thinking about, well, what do I want to write about? And I didn't want to write just about like a social story like Gossip Girl. I wanted to write about a mystery. And I was always really into stalkers. I was really into people like following you around and like watching you and kind of like knowing things about you and secrets, because everybody has secrets. The other interesting thing is that when I sort of developed the idea for Pretty Little Liars, which there are some Pretty Little Liars, bad picture, it's kind of dark. Texting, so this was like 2005. Texting had just become kind of a thing. Social media didn't exist. There was no Snapchat. There was no like, the interaction on phones was a little bit different, so now it was just like texting. So my big hook was, well, these girls are getting these anonymous texts, you know, and what is that, and what is that like? So I feel like it still makes a lot of sense, but it is kind of funny that like text messages were like, whoa, the new thing. But so I developed the idea for Pretty Little Liars. And if you guys haven't read Pretty Little Liars or seen the show, it is about 4 really good friends, Arya, Spencer, Hannah, and Emily, and they are all different. And they have this 5th best friend who is like the ringleader, and she's kind of awful, Allison. She's kind of horrible. Now, she's not as horrible in the show, but she's pretty horrible in the books. And she knows things about all of these girls. She has dirt on all of them. And she's pretty manipulative, but you just want to be her, and you want to be, you know, you want to be in her good graces. And they're having a sleepover, and it's kind of like there's a little bit of a fight that happens, but at the end of the sleepover, Allison goes missing, and you never know what happens to her. And then some time passes, and the first book starts a few years later, where the 4 main characters are not friends anymore. They start getting these messages from somebody known only as A, and they're about secrets from the past, but they're also about secrets from the present. And they're like, is this Allison? What is going on? And then originally I planned for Pretty Little Liars to be 4 books. And there would sort of be an arc of 4 books, and we find out who A is at the end of the 4th book. By the 2nd book, this was amazing to me because I never thought I was going to write a single book. The publisher said, we want more Pretty Little Liars, so they bought 4 more. So I was like, okay. So I had to figure out by book 5 what was going to happen once we found out who A was. How is this going to be, you know, a scary mystery? So that involved a lot of like, when I write a book, you know, there's what you see in the book, but there's a lot of extra material too. There's like all this backstory, all these pages I write that don't even get into the book. What's going on behind the scenes, what A is thinking, what the girls are thinking, what each girl is thinking. There's a lot of moving parts. And I have files upon files of like kind of how it all fits together. I also outlined all of these books before I really sat down to write them, and they were like long 20-page outlines that were very intricate because it was 4 main characters and it was a lot of stuff. It was a lot of stuff going on. So I was going along writing. This was about 2009. I thought Pretty Little Liars was going to be 8 books. I was really excited about that, and I got a phone call, I think it was in about October. And the publisher called me and they said, you know, the rights to the books were with the network called ABC Family, now they're called Freeform. Well, there's a pilot, I hadn't read the pilot, there's a pilot episode, there's a script of Pretty Little Liars, and the Freeform network likes it enough that they are going to shoot the pilot. And I was like, what? I had no idea. I knew that like some screenwriters were trying to adapt the books, but this had been going on for years. And at first I was like, I'm super cool, like I'm getting a TV show. But after a couple of years, I was like, that's never going to happen, and that's great because I like writing these books. I don't care. So I was really surprised when I got the call saying this pilot is going to happen. They're going to shoot it. We're casting some people in it. And I was like, what? I was living in Philadelphia. This was happening in LA. I had no real hand in casting these people. And when the characters were cast, I was a little bit like, wait a minute, that doesn't look like my Hannah. That doesn't look like my Emily. So I was a little bit nervous, and I know a lot of the readers were a little bit nervous too. But as soon as I saw the pilot, they sent me like a DVD early. I felt very special. I saw that they acted a lot like my characters, so I felt much better. And soon after that, I found out that it was going to be, you know, a whole season of a show, and it was like a whirlwind of crazy things. And it's still very, it's after all this time even, and the show isn't on anymore, it just ended, which is sad. It still is very surreal that it even happened, and that it kind of went on for so long. I feel like this is from a later episode. I think this was the Dollhouse, which was one of my favorite episodes. It was so creepy. It was when Abe trapped them in that like weird bunker. And so these are things also that are not in the books. And that's the kind of cool thing that you know, you can do with TV is you can kind of take an author's ideas and spin them out and like add your own touches to them. And a lot of people ask me, well, did that bother you? That they took your ideas and like made up new stuff, and no, it did not bother me. It felt like a little bit of a parallel Pretty Little Liars universe, or like if I was able to write like, you know, 30 books instead of 16, which is still a ton of books to get through, 16. I feel like, you know, this might have, you know, maybe I would have written about these things too. Although I feel like that Dollhouse was genius, and I love that episode. And I have been very, very happy with the TV show. I mean, I think for me it was like incredible that there was a TV show, period. But I think I loved how creepy they made it. I loved that there were funny moments. I loved all the twists and turns. And I was happy with all the A's. Everybody asks me that. Like, were you happy with all those like people that, you know, because there were a few A's in the show, as it was in the books too. But I was happy with all of the decisions that they made. And I'm glad that the A's in the show were different than the A's in the books because, you know, if you read the books, then you'd sort of know what was going to happen in the show. So it was sort of fun to see them doing different stuff. And also, I watched the show like anybody else. I didn't know ahead of time. I didn't want to know ahead of time. I didn't know any spoilers. I wanted to just like go on Twitter and tweet about it, just like everybody else, and be shocked. And yeah, so that was fun. So I was on the show twice. This is the second time, which I was much more polished the second time. So the first time they wanted me on the show, this was before it even aired. And this was like in 2010, and they said, we want you as like a special guest on Pretty Little Liars. And I was like, okay. I'd never acted before. I tried out for the 7th grade play, did not get in. I don't know why. I had to sing, so it was maybe that. So I flew to LA. They brought me to the lot, the Warner Brothers lot, where they were filming it, and I got a trailer, I got hair and makeup, it was all very fancy. But then they gave me lines, and I didn't know that I was going to have lines like before that day. I knew that I was going to play a teacher, Ms. Shepard, but I didn't know I was going to have to speak. And there were actually a lot of lines, and so I had to like memorize. maybe this is easy for people who do plays, I don't know. But I had to memorize them within this short amount of time. And then there were like these cameras just looking at you. And I had to do a scene with Lucy Hale. So it was like me and Lucy Hale doing this scene, who's like, you know, she's got a lot of experience. I was like sweating, and the first couple takes, I was like a robot. I made no sense, but eventually I was able to do it. This second time was way easier because I was just like a talking head. I was a news reporter talking about Allison. She was on trial for murder, I think. And I just had to talk to a screen. So it was way, way easier, and I had to like, you know, I was much more relaxed. But my first time in TV was a little bit scary. So like I said, the show ended I think it ended, do you guys know, it ended like last July maybe? Last August, something like that. This was on the very last day of the shoot. I took my son to LA. He hadn't even been born when the show aired. So he like grew up with Pretty Little Liars. In fact, there was a school for the blind named after him on the show, the Christian School for the Blind. And so I got to the set, and the actors were more interested in him than they were in me. And that is my sister on the end, the sullen kid who was angry on vacation, got to come too, so that was fun. And the other fun fact is my sister's name is Allison. And I asked her before I submitted the Pretty Little Liars long ago to be a book. I was like, do you mind if you're like the really mean dead girl? And she was like, no, I'm fine with that. She's very happy about it. One other fun fact, which I realized I forgot to share with you, is the character that I named after an elementary school friend is Ezra Fitz. So the Ezra Fitz story is that while I was writing the book, there was an English teacher. I had a really smart friend in elementary school who I lost touch with named Ezra Fitz, so I named him that. And thought nothing of it. The book comes out. It was a couple months later, and he found me, and this is like embarrassing to say, but I think he found me on MySpace. And he like messaged me on MySpace, and he's like, is this the same Sara Shepard who went to Coral Street Elementary, and she wrote, she did a magazine called Maze Magazine, and I was like, I did a magazine called with mazes that I distributed to the whole class. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, did you name a character after me? And I had to be like, oh yes, but he's a great character. He's not like, you know, doing wrong things with his student or anything. No, I was like, he's a great character. He had a really good sense of humor about it. He works at a bookstore in Tennessee and actually recommended the new book that I have out, The Elizas, and wrote like a little card underneath the book saying like, take it from Ezra Fitz, the real Ezra Fitz, this book is good. So he had a good sense of humor about it, but it was sort of embarrassing too. So if you guys are writers, be careful about like naming somebody after somebody you know, like change it a little bit or change details a little bit, because I just never thought he would read it. But somebody must have told him, hey, there's a, yeah, so, and then he was a big character on the show, and so it's kind of funny. So before we get to your questions, there are some questions that I often get that people ask me that I thought I would sort of use people from We're Life in My Stories, yeah. That I thought I would talk about a little bit, and then we can get to your questions, and then if we have like signing or anything like that. So one of the questions that I get is, how do I come up with ideas? And I know that's a really hard thing for writers that writers deal with. Like, what is your spark? How do you start? With Pretty Little Liars, like I said, I was just really into stalkers. I just loved I used to sort of put anonymous messages that were not mean, they were just weird, into people's lockers. In high school, I was a weird kid. I was just sort of into just like weird stuff going on and not understanding why. But for other stories I've come up with, it's sometimes a story from the news, it's sometimes I listen to a lot of podcasts. about, either murder mysteries, like real crime murder mysteries, or just strange, stories or things like that. And I read just anything online that pops up. You can get ideas from anywhere. I get a lot of people who come up to me too and say, oh, I have a great book idea for you. And as annoying as that can be, it's also great because sometimes it is a really good idea. Or it can spark a really good idea. I keep like a little book where I will write things down. I'll look at it later. Sometimes I often write things down on my phone in the notes app. Often I look at it later and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Even dreams. So like, just be open to anything because ideas are everywhere, and there's a lot of places that you can find ideas. Do I outline or just go with the flow? I did say that I wrote we'll write like 20-page outlines for Pretty Little Liars. Although for some books. And for all of my books, really, you can write an outline, but an outline only does so much. You can be writing and kind of realize this is not the right thing for my character at all, or this doesn't feel right. It felt right in an outline, but as I'm writing this, I have a better idea, and so you don't have to stick to your outline. Now, I wrote a new book called The Elizas, where I started kind of blindly, and knew I wanted it to be about a girl trying to kind of figure out who her almost killer was, but I didn't know where it was going to go, and I didn't do a lot of preliminary figuring out, and that was kind of fun too, because I sort of figured it out along the way, and realized that she would be writing like a book within a book, and some of those book chapters sort of give hints to what's going on in her own life, but that took a lot of I had to make a lot of wrong turns to do that. It kind of depends on how you like to work. If you're really if you like having things planned out, an outline is probably the way to go. But if you're comfortable with just sort of going with the flow and whatever, then there's no right way to try to write something. So, have I used people from real life in my stories? Spoiler, yes. Often people ask me where I got the characters from Pretty Little Liars from the main characters. They're all very different. So, and the answer is actually, this is going to sound really narcissistic, they were all me from different years of my life. So Emily, no wait, who did I start with? Hannah. Hannah was me in junior high. So Hannah in the books and in the show was she was really into being popular, really into doing the right thing, wearing the right clothes and looking, never making a mistake, having the right friends. And that was very me in junior high. I, wanted to sort of be invited to all the right parties and wear the cool clothes and whatever. And I had a lot of journals about that, so I was able to sort of harness Hannah-ness from that. Next, I was sort of Emily. Emily was a swimmer. She was sort of doing what her parents wanted her to do. I was also a swimmer growing up. And, my parents they weren't really pushing me to be, to kind of get more serious about it, but I knew they wanted me to. And like Emily in the books, there was a point, I think I was a sophomore in high school, where I was just I don't want to do it anymore. And kind of the fallout of that. And so that felt like, a starting point for Emily of what I was going through. Then came Aria. I was Aria in the later years, where I was just I want to be an artiste, and I am fancy, and I want to get out of this suburban school. Because I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, kind of where Pretty Little Liars is set. And I was just oh, you people are just, I need to go on to bigger and better things. Did not have anything going on with my English teacher or anything like that. And I don't advise that. So that was sort of my inspiration for Aria. Spencer was me throughout school. I was always really into, getting an A and being part of clubs and doing well and whatever. Spencer was also really based on a best friend of mine who was probably even crazier about her grades than I was. I mean, she would cry if she got a B in gym. It was come on. She was very, very Spencer, and her home life was very Spencer. But yeah, I mean, if you guys are writers, it's, you know, it's natural to kind of use people that you know for stories. I mean, they're there, you know how they talk, you know what they're into, you know details about them that are fun. You know, like I said, with the Ezra Fitz thing, I would advise you not use their real names, and maybe change some details a little bit. But you know, creating characters, they say write what you know for a reason, and that's, you know, it kind of pulls that person onto the page and makes them immediately knowable for you. And you know, I feel comfortable having at least a starting place from all of my characters. They often like kind of evolve beyond, you know. Hannah had many things that weren't me in the books, but as did, you know, any of my characters. But it's fun. It's good to have like a starting place of like, oh, let's base this kind of on this friend or my mom or whatever. And I feel like you might feel a little bit more comfortable getting into your story that way. And then before I answer your questions, I hope you'll have some. Do I have advice for writers just starting out? I feel like I get this a lot because there are a lot of young writers, which is awesome. And I think, you know, the thing that I was told, obviously, is to read a lot. I mean, that's sort of a silly thing. Read a lot. Even if you like listen a lot, listen to stories a lot. I don't know. I think reading is great, but I also think like if you listen to audiobooks, if you listen to podcasts, if you, you know, just sort of absorb stories as much as you can. And even bad writing, you know, the interesting thing about a book where you're like, this is just so bad, it's interesting to read those books sometimes because it's like you'll understand what you don't want to do in a story. Like, this is so bad, I don't want to write anything like this. But moreover, it's great to read books that you do love because you'll kind of, you know, want to do sort of your fan fiction version of them and write, do things as well as those writers do. So obviously read a lot. The thing that I never did when I was in high school was show my stuff to other people. I was like deathly, you know, embarrassed of showing my writing to anybody, except for like a teacher here and there but I couldn't imagine showing it to like a group of peers because I didn't want to be critiqued. But you kind of have to get over that if you want to write, because, you know, as a writer you have to have thick skin, but also when somebody else reads your stuff, you kind of get you get some good feedback, and you have to sort of be willing to listen to that. And I know, like, today there are so many great resources online that, you know, that writers can kind of go to and share your stories. And if you guys write fan fiction, there's so many different places where you can share fan fiction. But I think it's important to have some, like, really kind of trusted people that you show your stuff to. And, like, maybe not your parents. I mean, a teacher is great too, but I almost feel like it's, you know, an unbiased person that just will say, like, hey, this is great, but this needs work, or whatever. I only found that later on when I was older and kind of wish I would have done it when I was a little bit younger. So those are like my two biggest points of advice. I think this is the end right there. That is the end. So, all right, questions? Yes?
Excuse me, 1 second. I was going to pass the microphone around for questions. All right, just so everyone can hear. So will you pass that to the next person when you're done? Thank you.
I'm Maya. Just want to say Pretty Little Liars literally got me through my junior year. Like, oh my gosh, I love Pretty Little Liars. But
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions. I'm not going to ask all at once. I'm going to let everybody answer. But,
that's great.
When you first came in, we were definitely talking about which character do we think she would be, and we literally said she has like vibes from all of them. So that's crazy that you said.
Oh, that's
you're
funny.
from all of them.
I saw your face, and you're like, oh yeah, yeah. That's so funny. You guys were like, yeah. When I answered that, that's funny.
Do you think you could have still gotten this far without college, or do you think college like played a huge role in your success?
The thing that obviously it was great to get a college education and, you know, get a whole English background and as a writer, as a writer of books, I feel like kind of being exposed to all that literature and great stories and like helped me become a writer. That said, I do know some authors who didn't go to college, and or who only made it through a few years. For me, also because I went to school in New York, it's kind of how I got the ghostwriting thing. Like I sort of made the connections by annoying people and being like right in their face. But this was also like the early 2000s. I feel like times have changed a little bit. I would still like absolutely recommend going to college. But as far as getting your work out there, I feel like it is easier to get. There's self-publishing, and there's just, you don't have to necessarily be in New York to get your book out there, and get an agent interested in you or something like that. But I think having the good sort of English lit background was good for me. Yeah.
Okay.
Pass it on to the next person who has a question.
There we go. Thank you.
Do you think that like you'll continue, like, I know the season's over now, but like, would you come up with like a different, like, them being older, like with kids maybe? Or...
Oh, that would be fun. So I forgot to mention, they shot a pilot. There's only so much I can talk about. They shot a pilot for a spin-off called The Perfectionists, PLL The Perfectionists or something. And which is based on another book. I wrote 2 books in the series. One was called The Perfectionists, and one was called The Good Girls. And it ends there, like there's no more. You don't have to read 16 books to find at the end. So they just shot that. They shot that in March in Portland. I went out to visit, and they're using a couple of the characters. They're using Mona and Allison, and that might be it. Though some of the other girls said they might come in too. So that's kind of fun. I think it'd be kind of fun to write more books, like in a few years. Once we see what happens with that or whatever. But I think it'd be fun to make them older, like in their 20s. Were you thinking, or something like that? Yeah. Or even with kids of their own, maybe, or something like that. That would be really fun. Pretty Little Liars was my first. It's like my baby. It was my first thing that I wrote that was not a ghostwritten thing. So for me, I could keep writing it. I love the characters. I think they're great. I'm a little sick of A, but I can keep writing about them. I love writing about them. So if somebody came to me and was like, "We want you to write, a book about PLLs as whatever," I would be like, "Yes, I will do that."
And like, what was like your parents' reaction like to like when they found out about like everything, like your books and then like the TV shows?
Oh, they were really excited. I mean, so my parents, my mom's a huge reader. My parents are both huge readers. This is, them being like, "What are you going to do with an English major?" was like maybe a week of confusion, and then they were fine with it. I do remember the day that I got a call that the book project had sold, and calling them, and there was a lot of screaming and excitement. And my parents, yeah, I mean, in the show, like nobody quite believed that was happening. But I brought my mom to the set. Have I brought her twice? I think I brought her twice. And like I said, I brought my son. I've never brought my dad. My dad has never come, which is kind of too bad. So yeah, they're really excited about it. I feel like they're always just bringing me books to sign. They're like, "This is my, friend's daughter's whatever." It's like, "Can you sign?" Yeah. So, no, they're very excited about it. So.
What made you want to do a show or book about everyday life, like as far as like teenagers in high school?
Versus like vampires or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
I think it's based on what I read growing up. I did not read a lot of fantasy. I didn't really read a lot of sci-fi. I mean, I probably read more science fiction than I read fantasy for sure. But mostly what I read was thrillers. I was really into Stephen King. Or just normal, like reality sort of books, where it was just about high school, or it was about families, or it was about whatever. So that was what I responded to, and I thought I could do. And you know, I to this day I could not write like a fantasy novel or a novel about like royalty or battles or I don't know. You kind of have to do what you're drawn to and what you're good at. And yeah, I always thought like writing about high school would be really interesting. So.
And I have another question. Were you always told no?
Was I always told no? Just with whatever, or just with?
As far as like your dreams.
I mean, as a writer, you are told no a lot. I am still told no. I have projects that go out now, and some editors don't want them. Like it's, you know, I remember before Pretty Little Liars sold, I was probably doing the ghostwriting thing, but I had short stories that I would send out to like little publishing, little presses. And no, rejection letters. I mean, you get a lot of rejection. As a writer, I was not. I mean, my family was supportive of me, so that was good. But even so, I also did a graduate program for fiction. And even when I was in that program, the head of the program said to all of us, the whole class, there were about 20 of us in the class, he was like, just so you know, probably none of you will get published. And I was like, geez. And that is the reality. You know, he was trying to like lower our expectations. Meanwhile, about 6 of us in that class have been published, so he was wrong. So yes, in writing, you get told no quite a bit, and you just have to, and it is horrible. To hear like an editor has passed, or to receive a rejection letter, or you get a bad review. I mean, don't read the reviews online. You know, that's a horrible feeling. So you just like, I usually just don't read anything.
And what book was the hardest part of your life?
For me to write, you know, the first books in all of my series were really hard because. So I've written quite a few series. So I wrote Pretty Little Liars. I wrote The Lying Game. The Perfectionist, which doesn't really count because there was only 2, and I wrote a series called The Amateurs, which was 3. And all of those, to write the first one and establish what the first one was, they were all really hard because it was kind of like, what am I doing? I remember The Lying Game was really hard because it's told from a girl who's alive and a girl who's dead, and I couldn't figure out like how I was going to make that dead girl talk. And like how much of the afterlife we're seeing and what she knew. And I went through so many drafts of that book, like 17 drafts of that book. So I would say that was maybe the hardest one. But I feel like the first Pretty Little Liars was really hard too. Of like, I wish I had the first draft of that somewhere because I bet none of it was used. You know, it was like, it was all scrapped to rewrite. And that's a horrible feeling too, when you get an edit letter from your editor to revise and you're like, well this, but then you just do it and it becomes a better book for it, so.
Sam?
How many revisions of Pretty Little Liars did you have to do the first?
Like the first book?
Yeah.
I don't even know. I mean, to get, so the book sold actually to a publisher on 8 chapters and like an outline of how the rest of it was going to go. So to do those 8 chapters, I probably did at least 5 or 6 drafts. So then I wrote a whole draft of the book after that. That whole thing was scrapped. So I did a second draft. I probably did about 5 drafts of that. So in all, like 10, and that is pretty normal for, and that doesn't count like drafts that stay with me, and I read them over, and I'm like, oh, that isn't working. These are drafts that I send to other people. They read, they send back, they're like, no, you know, you have to change this, or here's a suggestion, or this character isn't working, or whatever. So it's, I wish I knew somebody who like could write, or I wish I could just write a book and it would be just perfect the first time around, but it's definitely not. Yeah. And I feel like every book that I wrote, like from that to the one that I just wrote, is many, many revisions and figuring out like what it actually is. Oh, hi.
Hi. Why did the Lion Game show
Continue.
I don't know. So the Lion Game show came out at a sort of crazy time for me. I had just had my son, and I was like sleep deprived and not really paying attention to it. I did watch the whole thing, but I didn't stay on top of like what was going on with it. Not that I would have had any sway, I don't think, in why. But the Lion Game show was really different than the Lion Game book. There were twins, but they were both alive. There was no murder. Well, there was no murder of the girl. I don't know, it was just very, very different. And while I loved the book series, and I loved writing the book series, I wasn't crazy about the show as much. I know a lot of people really liked the show. So I guess it just wasn't popular enough, not enough people were watching it, so they decided not to continue it. But I feel like they left off at like a really big cliffhanger, right? Does anybody know? Yeah, okay. I don't remember. Feel terrible. Any other questions?
I have a question over here.
Oh.
Yes, as Mr. Mullen.
Hello.
Hi. You mentioned Stephen King as one of the authors that influenced you.
Yeah.
What are some of the other books that you remember, or, for our readers here, any suggestions for things either now or, in the past?
Yeah, I loved, and you know what, I used to have a slide on that presentation. I guess I took it off for some reason, I don't know why. I love Stephen King. I think Stephen King paces really well. He's a little bit gory sometimes, but he's great to read for pacing and for suspense. I loved an author called Lois Duncan. She was more like a 90s author. She wrote a book called I Know What You Did Last Summer, which I think was a movie, and then a couple of other these just thrillers, and there were not a lot of teen thrillers out at the time. And there was another author called Christopher Pike, who was very similar, teen thrillers. When I was writing Pretty Little Liars, there were a couple of books that I really thought were great. There was a book called The Basic Eight. It was by Daniel Handler. He's also the Lemony Snicket guy. And The Basic Eight was about this group of kids. They were all really smart, and they did something horrible. And it was sort of unraveling this horrible thing that happened, and I felt very inspired by that. And that came out a little bit before Pretty Little Liars. And another book that I really loved was called The Secret History, and that was by Donna Tartt. She's more of an adult author, but The Secret History is about kids in college. And again, there's a theme here. They have done something horrible, and they have to cover it up. So it's like, those were sort of my favorites that I used for, to inspire Pretty Little Liars, that I just thought were very well, just like the suspense in them and sort of the mystery. But I've always been a big reader, and in high school, and would read sort of anything except fantasy. But I would read nonfiction. I would read a lot of classics. But I would read a lot of contemporary stuff too. And my mom was a big reader. My mom still is a huge reader. She buys so many books. I think she keeps Barnes and Noble in business. She just buys so many books. So anything that I have read, she has read already. I sort of got that from her, which is good. I really feel like reading is sort of the best thing you can do if you want to be a writer. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, you haven't asked my name.
Are you ever completely satisfied? How do you know when you're done?
I know. That is hard. Because, and the funny thing is, I read a book that I wrote probably about 10 years ago called The Visibles. I read it. I just read the first page the other day, and I was like, oh, I would write this so differently now. But with a manuscript, when you're done. I don't know. I know when I'm done when I'm just sick of looking at it anymore. Where I feel like everything kind of makes sense, and, I've just read it too many times, and I don't even know if it's good anymore, so I'm like, somebody else has to read this. Often when I do that, I will realize oh, I should have changed that, but then the person already has it. That is a hard thing to know. I feel like I'm never done. With that the book I wrote, The Visibles, that I recently reread, I was like, I wish I could go back and rewrite it. I won't, but yeah, I mean, I'm really critical of anything that I do, so it's like, yeah, it's hard. That's a very hard thing to know. And then you had a question?
So a question here and then one more after.
Okay.
So me and my best friend definitely want to write books, and we always do research on like what to do, but on Google, like it never tells you the process you have to go through to publish a book. So what is the process? Like, what do you do to publish a book?
To get a book published? Well, I mean, I think there's like a few different ways you can go about publishing a book. You could just self-publish a book. You could go on, I feel like Amazon has like a self-publishing route where you can, I don't know how that works exactly. But you don't have to, go through the traditional channel. But the traditional way is you find an agent, and the way to find an agent is whatever your book is about, you sort of find a literary agent that maybe represents other authors sort of that write books like your book, or maybe authors who, or agents who are interested in young adult, or whatever genre you're writing in, whether it's young adult or romance or mystery or whatever. So then you sort of query them and say, like, you can write them an email, which is great these days, because when I was starting out, it was kind of harder to find agents and email them. But you can write them an email and say, I have this idea, here are some pages, and you can look up online, there's sort of like sample query letter, like sort of pitch, how to pitch an agent. And then hopefully the agent will want to see your pages, and then they'll decide to represent you. So when they represent you, you get your manuscript into good shape between you and the agent, which sometimes can be like your agent can act as like your editor, like kind of say, like, okay, I think you need to change this, I think you need to revise here, I think you need to, make some suggestions. And then once your agent thinks your story is like ready to go, he or she will like shop it to publishers, and then hopefully an editor at that publishing house will buy it, and then they put it out and it becomes a book. But like I said, there is a way where you can self-publish as well. But I feel like the more traditional way is still kind of working, I guess. There are also conferences you can go to where you can meet agents, depending on what you write. I know that there are big conferences for romance. I know there are conferences for children's books, which would include YA. There are probably conferences for other genres as well. Those are just the ones I happen to know too, because I've been to those. Where you can kind of arrange to have like a 5-minute pitch session with with an agent that you want to talk to, and you can say, this is my idea, and they can give you advice, or maybe they can ask for your manuscript. That was a very like technical walkthrough of like how you get a book published, but.
All right, last question.
Okay.
Okay, so what is your strategy for like tying in loose ends or like stuff like that, like later in the book?
Tying in loose ends. Well, often I will realize like a loose end or a clue later in the book, and then I'll just go back and just put it, a hint to it earlier. Just because you've like written a chapter and you're on to another chapter doesn't mean like that chapter's done. I feel like I'm always kind of changing stuff the more I go forward with something. I also put notes to myself at the beginning of a manuscript, like, tie in more of this, tie in more of that, where it's like, I almost want to get the plot out first and like sort of how the book works, and then do sort of those smaller details. But yeah, loose ends, I mean, you have to keep track of that. And sometimes I forget, and sometimes I will get, edit letters back with like, you totally lost this character or something like that. It's like, oh, like I said, you can only read something so many times before you can't really see it like for what it is anymore. So, yeah. You guys had great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here today.
Those are some really